Ready? Hello, everyone. Hi there. Thanks for coming. We're grateful we can all be gathered here today. Doubly grateful, in fact, because this is our second attempt to bring Brian here to speak to us. We tried in mid-January and woke up to snow and a campus closure, and then 2 hours later, high winds and ferry shutdowns, and so it was quite a day. But here, you're all back, so this is great. On behalf of my series co-convener, Alison Wiley, welcome to the second event in the new year of our Green College cross-sectoral seminar series, Indigenous Science Partnerships Exploring Histories and Environments. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. UBC's land acknowledgement, while brief, holds power in the collection of concepts it brings together. The term traditional acknowledges that this land is traditionally used and occupied by the Musqueam people. The term ancestral acknowledges that this land is handed down from generation to generation. And the term unceded acknowledges that this land was not turned over to the Crown, the Canadian government, by a treaty or other agreement. Together, these terms speak to our colonial past, to how that past remains unresolved and a part of our collective present and future. The land acknowledgement also speaks to the fundamental relationship between people and place. Link Kessler, a professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies and former director to the UBC First Nations House of Learning, said, quote, "Here at UBC on the Vancouver campus, when we make this acknowledgement, we're acknowledging the past history, but we're also acknowledging our present relationship with Musqueam and with other Indigenous communities in Canada and worldwide. And our commitment to research relationships, which are collaborative and work to Indigenous communities' benefit, not to their detriment." Our speaker today, Dr. Brian Thom, has been working collaboratively with Indigenous communities for the past 25 years, with a particular focus on the ways people and communities are dynamically and powerfully connected to place. His work is concerned with the very concepts invoked by the land acknowledgement, issues of space, history, and Indigenous sovereignty. His research focuses on the political, social, and cultural processes that surround Indigenous peoples' efforts to resolve Aboriginal rights and titles claims and establish self-government. Dr. Thom is an associate professor at the University of Victoria's Anthropology Department, and in 2010, he founded UVic's Ethnographic Mapping Lab. The lab has become a place for graduate students and faculty researchers to collaborate with Indigenous communities on projects that support Indigenous land rights, resource management, intergenerational knowledge sharing, and public education. He has worked in Coast Salish communities on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, and has recently conducted collaborative research with the Atelman in Kamchatka. In his own words, quote, "Collaboration with Indigenous communities is transforming the way anthropologists approach ethnographic mapping. New digital mapping technologies make it possible to construct maps that frame multiple layers, scales, and perspectives, providing visual, textual, media-rich polyphony." Tonight, Dr. Thom will navigate this terrain, exploring the potential and pitfalls of these new approaches to mapping, how they endeavor to engage diverse audiences, address varied agendas, and weave together multiple ways of seeing the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Thom.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm and kind introduction, and also for that fulsome acknowledgement of the place that we're here on the lands of the Musqueam people. I can say, walking through campus this morning, this is a very different place to recognize that we're in Musqueam lands than it was in the late 80s when I was a student here. You can see signs of it everywhere, and then I think in the 80s, it was just an unknown, really. Not even the museum was a great place to realize that you were in the lands and territories of Musqueam. So I'm really pleased to hear that acknowledgement tonight, and I acknowledge it as well, and I'm very honored to be here with you all. I also want to acknowledge the experience that I had at UBC that was very instrumental to me being here today. I was a student in the anthropology department here, just next door, for many years as my BA and MA as I took those. And I had the great benefit of being mentored and taught to by a number of wonderful professors. I'm delighted to see several of whom are in the room tonight. So I do really want to point out the wonderful contributions of Dick Pearson, who's really the reason I became an anthropologist and didn't go into print advertising for magazines, which was the original plan. Julie Cruikshank, David Pocatello, Bruce Miller, who we can congratulate today, was announced by CASCA, Canadians Anthropology Society, won the most prestigious anthropology award in Canada this year. So congratulations, Dr. Miller. Yeah. Mike Blake, also very influential in my learning, and R.G. Matson. So these people were really foundational to how I come to understand what anthropology was all about, and what collaboration even meant. And I think that in those days it wasn't the kind of household term that it is today, and I think very much the embodiment of collaborative practice happened here in this department in those late 80s, early 90s years. So I thank you guys who are all here tonight, and really glad to see you. I also just wanted to point out that I got my start in mapping working by drawing hand-drawn maps as a contract gig as a grad student. I was handy with a rapidograph pen and sheets of vellum and mylar, and I could draw out a nice map. And Dr. Miller invited me to participate in creating a map for the Upper Skagit tribe in a case that they were running, a Bolt 2 decision, really it ended up being, US v. Washington around shell fishing rights. And I remember the summer of 1994 working for a very long time trying to draw this map out, trying to figure out what it is that needed to be said in the courtroom. I didn't really have any idea, but I did get quite high on chart pack markers because I ended up coloring the whole thing with markers. And I think you have a copy of the map here tonight.
The one that you used in court finally is about 5 feet high. This is Brian's original map, and it shows the foreshore so that these people upriver, you can see that they're fishing down here. That was the point of the case, that these villagers be allowed to fish. So this is my souvenir.
Well, thanks for bringing that tonight, Bruce. And I mean, certainly that was the time when I realized as a graduate student that there's a real nexus between the kinds of ways that anthropologists work and the kinds of information anthropologists are interested in, the legal and political goals of Indigenous communities, and the kinds of struggles that they continue to have, and the practice of cartography, this very powerful way of charting out Indigenous knowledge and experience on the land and making that visible in a certain way of representing things, like in a detailed map like this. So really that was the start. That was sort of day one of this job that I'm telling you about tonight. So as Eric said in the introduction there, I did when I got to UBC or to UVic as a professor 10 years ago, I was still very interested in maps. I'll tell you a little bit about that whole journey, but I was thinking about what I wanted to do as a scholar. You know, I had been working in land claims for 14 years before coming back into academia, and I thought, well, you know, maps are very powerful, and we should be thinking about maps and thinking critically about how to use them and make them meaningful and manage the dangers and power that maps have in these kinds of contexts around Indigenous land rights and human rights, resource management, and so on. And I kept thinking about, well, what are ethnographic maps all about? Like, what are really the maps that anthropologists draw? And they tend to be these kinds of maps that you see on this slide here, the kind of territorial boundaries, kind of neat, contiguous, familiar-looking maps that you find in the inside cover of your ethnographies. There's probably very little really written about those maps, but they tend to say a lot. They tend to be the expert, anthropological expert, right, making an interpretation of what what the space is and places are that the indigenous communities they're working with are all about. And it really strikes me that that these maps are so inadequate to the task of ethnography. You know, they don't really pull in the kind of ways that we have these intersubjective dialogic relationships with people, that we're talking and sharing about culture and history and meaning and the significance of place and history. And in a way like this artist Lawrence Paul Yahualeptum has done in his painting, that's a far more powerful map that can be read over and over and over again in many different ways as you start to learn the stories behind all of the figures and the different things that that map evokes. And so how could we go about getting our maps more towards that kind of practice? How can we really start to embody a practice of ethnography in our cartography? Those are the kind of questions I just wanted to open up with as I opened up this lab, and then think, how can we make those maps powerful for our communities? And I realized that the history of ethnographic mapping actually has some seriously problematic roots. And if we think about where some of the very early maps that ethnographers working in our area here were making, these are people who by and large were part of a project of the Department of Interior through the Bureau of American Ethnology that were going out to make maps of indigenous communities to facilitate the removal of those communities from their lands. They're trying to map out what languages and cultures and political organizations were similar enough that the Department of Interior then could remove people from all the places that they lived and place them on reservations in the US. And they asked for ethnologists to go out and create maps to facilitate that removal, that land removal. And so I think that we have this very strong tradition of this kind of ethnographic mapping, these kind of creating these neat contiguous boundary lines with a name inside that indicates some sort of notion of indigenous people's location in that place. But I think that we haven't done a very good job of querying that and of problematizing those maps and of trying to come up with a different way to engage this kind of cartographic practice. So I have the worry about these maps and this kind of ethnographic approach in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about ethnographic mapping. I think this is problematic and dangerous. These kinds of maps get scrutinized and looked at very carefully in the kind of land claims contests, which get concerned with overlaps and which map is closer to the truth. You get a map like Boaz's here, that the pink map closest to me, and it is a remarkably interesting map if you get your magnifying glass out and really look at what Boaz was able to find out in 2 weeks of being in Victoria. But a map like that has really become, I think, the norm of what we think, what we expect as the kind of essential map. So, and I recognize too that indigenous communities also make these kinds of maps. They've also drawn on the ethnographic mapping tradition and to represent their territories in the kinds of political and legal arenas that land claims are being negotiated or litigated or sought recognition of. And some of these maps, like the Squamish map that's closest to me again, end up being quite powerful, quite interestingly powerful, and get recognition. And other kinds of maps, don't. And it just strikes me, I've just been thinking a lot about all the people who today are out a lot less comfortable than we are. They're trying to raise awareness across Canada about issues, about the recognition of land title and rights and governance. They're trying to give some political momentum for people in government and elsewhere to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think about the maps that the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en communities showed in the Delgamuukw case. They drew on this kind of mapping tradition. I can have a very clear picture in my mind of the Wet'suwet'en map that went into that case. And it's another one of these maps with a thick, dark outline, and inside are all these about 133 perfectly interlocking little areas that that represent the owned lands of the different houses, in each of which are part of the different clans. So they argued for this map. And unfortunately, in that case, we had the Supreme Court of Canada actually not making any findings of fact about what Aboriginal title actually looked like at the ground. The map ended up really not really mattering to the court. And so we have this ongoing unresolved issue as a result of that case. So my point, I guess, tonight for the purpose of this talk, other than to send our best wishes out to the people who are out there today trying to bring closure to these issues, is that the maps we make have power, and we need to be careful with them, and we need to attend to that power very carefully. I worked for 10 years as a negotiator for the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. This is an Indigenous political organization based then out of Ladysmith on Vancouver Island. It represented about 7,000 members of 6 different Hul'qumi'num communities on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Those negotiations started in 1993. They're still ongoing today. There's no clear resolution in sight for those talks. And I remember in 2006-07, so we were a good 15 years into the talks, the elders that were providing the mandate for the discussions at the table were getting very frustrated. They were saying, well, why can't we conclude these negotiations? Just show them our maps. You know, it's very clear that we have a connection to the land. They need to recognize this. And I remember very clearly the negotiators at the tables not really being very interested in talking about the details of what those maps actually said. They already had their minds made up as to what the treaty package would look like and what the details really were. And so we continued on in a place where we had hoped that these maps would be more powerful than they actually were. Another example of this, maybe caution, is a project I ran, one of the first projects after actually finishing my MA here at UBC. I was hired by the Stalo Nation right at the beginning of the treaty process, and we got some funding from the Ministry of Forests to do a traditional use study, modeled after the kinds of projects that had happened in the Arctic, land use and occupancy studies in the late 70s and early 80s. We carried out one with about 100 Stalo people being interviewed about a particular study area that was defined by the province in order to help Stalo Nation engage in consultations around forestry. And again, if you look at the Stalo Atlas, that beautiful atlas that was published a number of years ago, you can see that even though we recorded all this information, the sort of level of liquidation forestry continued on in those areas of the Fraser Valley. These are tools that we have a lot of hope in, but I think are also fairly problematic. And maybe lastly, a little example here is the work that Liaxin First Nation did, drawing on a range of projects that I had the fortune to be involved with. And they put forward their maps as part of the National Energy Board hearings for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And in particular, they're expressing their concerns around the marine transportation issues in the event of a catastrophic spill. And again, I think there's a lot of hope in this kind of land use and occupancy data. A lot of energy and money and resources and elders' time and effort went into documenting these kinds of things. But I think everybody in the room knows what the status of that project is, right? These maps haven't held up, I think, quite the potential to have that sort of power. You know, we're in a situation where there are there are these ongoing challenges, and Indigenous communities are asking for partners like universities, like students, like a very healthy consulting company community that's out there providing support to Indigenous communities to document Indigenous knowledge spatially and to represent that in different ways, and to bring that into these conversations and these contests around the challenging lands and resources, the extraction of resources and land alienation. I can think of the situation with the Halkamenem Treaty Group. We, frustrated with the negotiations that had gone on for years and years and years, the leadership of the Halkamenem Treaty Group launched a human rights case at the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights in Washington, D.C. It's a case against Canada. You can all check it out if you're interested in looking that up. It's a case where the Halkamenem communities were suing Canada for human rights violations subject to the OAS Charter and the OAS Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man that was signed by all the states in the Americas shortly after the Second World War. And so they wanted to raise the point that in the Halkamenem communities, there are a whole string of colonial legacies that can be mapped out that are a direct line to the kinds of social inequalities and economic inequalities and really human rights crises that happen in many communities, including the Halkamenem communities. Fundamental to this on Vancouver Island was the 1884 Enn Railway Grant. This was a deal with the coal baron, Robert Dunsmuir, who, in exchange for financing the construction of the railway from Esquimalt up towards Campbell River, he was given fee simple title to the entire southeast coast of Vancouver Island. Freehold fee simple title. It's private land, and that's a lot of private land. So the territories of the Halkamenem peoples are actually quite unlike 95% of British Columbia, which is crown land. Even compared to the lower mainland, there's so much private land in Halkamenem people's territory that it's very difficult to negotiate resolution of any of these issues. And so we work to show the kinds of devastation that private land forest practices have, for instance, in terms of the effective industrial clear cutting that doesn't go through a crown forest referrals process, right? It's a very different kind of forestry that happens on private land than on crown land, and a very different way that communities are able to engage the decisions about those practices. So we were able to map out, using Google Earth Engine, some of the extent of that forestry even over the last 30-year period to provide some of that context of industrial forestry. Or in the areas that weren't forests, the extent of urban development, and even the way that things like light pollution that this map is showing has an impact on people's way of relating to the places that are important to them. And certainly in terms of all the black areas that are right along the waterfront, many of the places that are of the most cultural and economic importance to the Halkamenem communities are completely alienated through urbanization. So it left a very challenging situation. And you might think, well, there's always the water. But of course, there's extreme difficulty in marine resources, including massive closures for shellfish, the need to depurate at best, shellfish harvested because of fecal coliform, so you can run it through commercially freshwater process in order to make them edible, but many of the other places are actually permanently closed with no possibility of those kinds of harvesting. And at the same time, extensive tenuring and licensing of the foreshore and a real impact on the marine environment through this kind of enclosure that's happened in Halkamenem people's territories. And as many of the archaeologists in the room will know, I'm sure, that there's also devastating impact on archaeological sites. And those have been borne by communities like the Hulkaminam community who have had conflict after conflict over desecration or destruction, fairly inadequate management of these sites, particularly when they occur on private lands. Again, I'm trying to keep that private land piece and focus in your minds. And so documenting the extensiveness of them, of those kinds of problems over these places over the years is a part of the argument in those cases. So, a lot of the issues around the creation of reserves and the whole process of the administration of the Indian Act is also directly linked to the kinds of, deep economic and social inequalities that Indigenous communities face. So one of the kinds of projects that we were involved in then is really trying to pay some attention to these issues that people were raising with us. People were telling us all about their concerns, and so we tried to draw them together into a digital atlas that we've made available through the internet through a very simple tool, Google My Maps. You guys can all probably already all have it on your phone in your pocket there. You could look these things up. But I think it's, this is one of our approaches to try to illustrate the kinds of challenges Indigenous communities have in their territories. But in spite of these challenges, there, of course, those deep cultural relationships to land and to landscape persist and are really vital to communities. And I'm going to do a little experiment now. I'm going to try a new way of presenting that until this very moment I've never done before. So I hope you'll bear with me. But I'm going to share with you all the brand new Google Earth for the web in present mode. So those of you who are teachers, take note. This is a great new way to basically do PowerPoint in Google Earth. I'm not a master of it yet, but I'm going to try to integrate it into my talk tonight. So, as I said, we have formed the Ethnographic Mapping Lab at the University of Victoria and have been working to basically connect graduate students and a number of undergraduate projects that have been very interesting as well with Indigenous communities who want to explore what ethnographic mapping might be able to do for them. So we basically have a shingle out saying if an Indigenous community wants a project done, they can contact us and we'll try to facilitate students working in those communities and producing the kind of maps that they'd be interested in. And also it's a place for myself to develop expertise and connections in the mapping world, and I've been very, very fortunate to have developed a relationship with the engineers of Google Earth down in Silicon Valley. And over the last 10 years, I've had the very fortunate opportunity to go down at least once or twice a year to Google headquarters and both learn advanced skills in using Google's freely available tools like Google Earth and provide input to the engineering team and to the product management teams as to the kind of things that Indigenous communities would find beneficial. And remarkably, I've seen suggestions that I've made actually show up in the software that you guys all have in your pockets right now. So it's a really cool part of my story, I think, but I won't dwell on that too much. But I do want to talk about maybe the first little example here of a project that I've been working on myself through the Ethnographic Mapping Lab. And this is a project in my own community in Cordova Bay, which is about 8 kilometers north of UVic, which I moved to about 3 years ago from Ladysmith. And when I got to Cordova Bay, I really didn't know much about where I was living and about the history of this place and of the Indigenous territories. I mean, of course, I had a basic knowledge, but I wanted to know a bit more. And at the very same time, the district of Saanich, the local municipality, was undergoing a brand new land use planning exercise. They were doing local area plans. These municipal land use plans get renewed every 20 years or so. And so I went to a public meeting just as a member of the audience, and I heard of all things about housing and transportation and parks and commercial development and the things that, sidewalks, all the things that are in municipal land use plans. And I raised my hand and I said, well, is there any consideration of, Indigenous peoples' history and territory and values in your land use plan? Seems like, it's a good place to do it. And the good people that were there at that meeting essentially told me that there were no Indian reserves inside this part of the municipality, so there was no obligation for them to really consider that. And I said, well, we should have a conversation about that. So I asked for a meeting with the senior staff in the municipality, in the planning department, and I went back and I made a little ethnographic map in Google Earth. I cobbled together what I could from I went to the library essentially, and because there's information about the lands that we live in. And I put together a little map like this one, and went and made a presentation to the senior staff in the planning department, and they said, well, we didn't know any of this. We just thought this was a place that really started in the 1870s when it turned into a farm and then turned into subdivisions post-war. We didn't know it had a history. We didn't know it had Indigenous people's values associated with this. Can you help us? And so I undertook a project, and now we'll flip back to our slideshow. Okay, whoop, no, we're too early. Curses. All right, what have we done? See, I knew this would be a bad experiment. So I reached out to Sayout First Nation and the Saanich Leadership Council, and I said, there's an opportunity here to have a fulsome conversation about what kind of future-looking visions does your community have for Tz'al'ich, the ancient village site that in fact was the subject of the South Saanich Treaty that Governor Douglas signed, as it happens on my birthday, but in 1852. And all of the kinds of important stories and histories that surround Tz'al'ich. And so they were very interested in having that conversation, and we spent a year basically walking around on the beach, having conversation with a few of the key elders in the communities about what their values are, and found out all kinds of things. And now I'm at the point in my talk where I asked, should I digress into all the interesting things or should I stick to the script? But I will just say that for the archaeologists in the room, again, we found all kinds of interesting archaeological things that had never been documented, including a fish trap that was right on the beach in the intertidal area, a couple of canoe runs, some high bank midden. But also looking through the archives, we found a history of vulgar desecration of the burial sites associated with Tz'al'ich. And these were stories that were well known in the papers, kind of funny little stories, if you read these headlines from the 40s and 50s and 60s. And to make our community of Cordova Bay, we physically removed and desecrated these graves and these people, these ancestors, at the very time that the people who were living in Sartlip were having their children taken away to Indian residential schools, or they were having their adults who were fighting TB locked up in Indian hospitals. This is the action that our communities were taking. So I believe that we should do something about this today. We don't have to live in ignorance of this history. We can map these places out. We can have conversations with the communities about what should be done about this, and we should make a plan. We should build that kind of information into our land use plans so that we have better land use plans that acknowledge ancestral presence in the land. right? The kinds of places that are important to Coast Salish peoples. And then we can start to work on other issues around renewal of places for harvesting. Try to get those beaches cleaned up. Try to get community members to be able to feel comfortable to come back to the places that, in this case, the Douglas Treaty spoke about was very much their community. So this spring, with a little money from the Dean of Social Sciences and a nice grant from the Union of BC Municipalities, we organized the first ever in 100 years meeting between the leadership of the 4 Saanich communities and the Saanich municipality to talk about land use planning. And we decided that we would hold this meeting at Salich, at the place that several of those graves were desecrated in, and in a banquet hall that's usually for weddings and so on, overlooking the water. And that we would follow, we wouldn't run it as a business meeting, we would follow Coast Salish practices for meetings, calling witnesses, having a speaker, and really that was an incredible moment of dialogue around the map and around the vision of what a land use plan could look like. And I can say that the final land use plan hasn't been approved by council yet, but I've been privileged to read the draft of it. And I can say in this 100 and so odd page land use plan, almost every page has a reflection of the kinds of values that we heard about through this work, through talking about the importance of the landscape. And I'm very, very optimistic. But I also know that the Saanich communities, they have many questions. They have lots more work that they want to do, filling in their own map. This is kind of an interesting little map that was submitted, again, as part of one of those National Energy Board hearings, summarizing some of the cultural data that Saanich communities had. And you can see that there's actually a gap in the data right around Salich, which is the place that we're talking about. So there's a real impetus for more research, for more oral history work, for more of this kind of integrative anthropological practice with the community in order to better inform what's happening in the future. So these are some of the kinds of research questions that came out of that dialogue. You know, not only questions about sort of legal and political instruments for recognizing and implementing Indigenous jurisdictions over those lands, but also Indigenous concerns around Indian names, ancestral names, about a giant who lived at Tsawwassen who threw boulders at ancestors who were retreating to Salich after they had learned a secret from him and violated his trust. So there's I think lots of important work to do. We're going to do this again. So the next little story I'll tell you about is just up the Salish Sea near Powell River in Tla'amin territory. And Tla'amin, as you may know, is one of the few communities who successfully negotiated and concluded a modern-day treaty. So it's an incredible achievement for that community to have fully run through the BC treaty process and come out the other side with an agreement that community is now busy implementing. And so they no longer have to worry about proving what their rights are, proving where their title lands are. It's in there quite clearly acknowledged between the two covers of that agreement. And in implementing the treaty, they're now asking new questions that aren't focused on these kinds of lawyerly contest questions, but questions about, again, the vision of the future for their lands and their territories. And they approached us to say, can you help us with collecting data from our communities about where they're implementing their treaty rights today? And looking at the 6 broad categories of rights that are in a modern day treaty, including hunting and fishing and gathering, but also rights related to culture. And can we map those out? Can we come up with some sort of zoning map that can aid the Tla'amin Nation government in making decisions about where its economic development initiatives ought to be compared to where its issues that support food sovereignty within their community ought to prioritize. And where they can, in these areas like the Theodosia watershed, which the treaty spells out as a co-managed area with the province, what kind of values they can bring to that table based on what community members are doing today in terms of their treaty rights. So we put together a survey that was done in the community by community members, and we used a kind of grid system to identify, to geolocate within these kind of 10-kilometer hex areas, 10 square kilometer hex areas, where these activities were happening. And the community has a very powerful tool now for understanding the location, the spatial arrangement of the exercise of modern day treaty rights. And it had a very important outcome, one of which was that some of the places that were really important for community members for exercising cultural practice, for local family level food security, filling the freezer, were the very places on treaty settlement lands that were being considered for economic development. And so if those are the places that are important for these kind of cultural reasons, it gives the Tla'amin Nation a new framework for the dialogue with the province about all the rest of the territory which is shared, and where those economic development issues could be relocated off treaty settlement lands for the benefit of Tla'amin and members. So it's, I think, a very interesting example of the way these kinds of conversations in the community can have, around these kinds of maps can lead to a different outcome. We talked about the Trans Mountain Pipeline a minute ago, and certainly the communities that Dr. Greer here works with at Penelkut and others are concerned about the possibilities of a catastrophic spill and what might happen to things that are important to them if there was a disaster. They're also very concerned about climate change and the issues that face their beaches. And in those dialogues that have happened with government, humble but important things like tlakas, a red laver, a porphyra seaweed, are basically overlooked. They're not endangered species. They're not particularly economically significant in the area. But they're culturally significant. And so one of the projects in our lab has been to work on a kind of an ethnobiology of tlakas, of this kind of culturally significant seaweeds with Halkometan peoples, but also to then work to provide the communities some tools for a baseline of where this significant seaweed is located and what might be changes over time. So I was very fortunate to get a student who is skilled at programming, and he's been working in Google Earth Engine to train the computers how to see the seaweed using the imagery that we can feed it. We're training it drone imagery, and then we're working to scale it up to other kinds of imagery that are provided in public data sets. And we're using it through a free and fairly easy to use window through Google Earth Engine that the algorithm can run and rerun as more data comes in, basically training the computers to see these culturally significant resources and provide those tools to communities as a kind of way of monitoring when they can't rely on governments or other agencies to do it for them. So the remote sensing project has been really pretty wonderful, and I look forward to the thesis that's coming out within a couple of months. He's almost done. Where are we going next? That's the seaweed. All right, so let's take another flight, shall we? Go to the Cowichan Valley. And So another project that we've been really involved in, I guess this is one of our big flagship projects, is at a couch and ancestral site called Yayumnuts. And I encourage you to check out the website, yayumnuts.ca, if you have your notepads there. There's a pretty neat website that we've been putting together over the last 3 years. And this is a place in the Cowichan Valley that's walking distance from these 3 schools. And it's an archaeological site that, in fact, when I was a grad student here at UBC, was under threat of development. And they had a consulting archaeologist come and give an assessment of what the significance of the site was, and it was more or less written off. But Cowichan Tribes wasn't satisfied with that answer, so they actually asked for a group of us from UBC. This was Doug Brown and Vicky Fedema and a bunch of Mike's students, actually. We all went in the summer of 1994 to provide a second opinion on what was there at the site. And what we found was, in fact, a very significant archaeological site, a settlement with at least 2,000 years of occupation, followed by an important burial site that was located right on top of the village site at a different period in the chronology. But Cowichan had to fight for 20 years, literally for 20 years, to get that site protected. It was, again, on private land, and the developer kept bringing proposal after proposal for redevelopment back to the table. I remember being at the treaty table at the time, and we said, look, if there's a place that's an obvious win-win for acquiring some private land to contribute to the treaty settlement package, Yayumnut is an obvious place for that. But we were never able to achieve that. Yayumnuts was saved through a different mechanism. And in about 5 years ago, my kids were going to school here in Duncan, and they had friends of mine whose parents are at Cowichan Tribes, so we're in the same class. And we went to parent-teacher night. And that night, there were these posters on the walls. And the kids were doing Greek archaeology, Roman archaeology, Egyptian archaeology. These are a grade 7 class. And so Diane and I, we said, why aren't you doing Cowichan archaeology? You know, you live here. About 20% of the kids in this classroom are Cowichan. And the teacher was like, well, we don't know anything about it. Like, you know, there's no information. It's impossible to know this kind of question. So we went, Cowichan applied for, it was shortly thereafter Canada's birthday, the 150, remember that? And so they applied for some money through the Canada 150 celebrations and got about half of what they asked for and pulled together a whole bunch of partners to commemorate Yayumnuts. They pulled in UBC's School of Landscape Architecture. Students drew up these beautiful landscape plans. Our department at UVic in the Anthropology department, we worked with elders and with teachers in the school district to come up with a whole series of resources that teachers could use to provide some insight into Cowichan values and teachings and history, and think about the kinds of difficult problems about, well, how should we behave when we go out to an Indigenous burial site with children, right? So what sort of protocols need to be followed in order to make it safe for everybody in that situation? We basically worked to draw together those teachings in an ongoing process with the school district. The municipality has chipped in a little bit of resources and time as well, and the province, FLNRO, the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resources Operations, has been paying for signage. So we've got some wonderful signs at the site locating Yayumnuts in the Cowichan cultural landscape. We have a series of trails, a large website of resources that's developed for teachers with a lot of Cowichan voice in there. And we're trying to draw connections, trying to draw people into the idea that when you're at this place, at a place like Yayumnuts, you're not just at an archaeological site, but you're at a place that's connected all across the Coast Salish world. So when you look at the, the archaeologists picked all the little bones and so on out of the screens, and those are the faunal record there, and that's all tabulated. And then we went to the Hulkaminum Treaty Group's maps to find out where the traditional use information was for the kinds of places that those resources are harvested. We realized, of course, it's not in a little creek 7 kilometers inland from the shore. Things like halibut and herring and rock cod and so on are from the ocean. And of course, there's a shell midden component to the site, so those are also from the ocean. So and some of these rare artifacts like obsidian, which can be identified with X-ray fluorescence as to its original home when it blasted out of the volcano in eastern Oregon, in Newberry, Oregon, or this incredible nephrite adze blade, which is from a jade that's identifiable up north of Boston Bar in the Fraser Canyon. It really shows the kind of connections that Cowichan people have had for a very long time across their landscape. Sort of breaking down those kind of ethnographic maps, right, where we have those nice, neat, contiguous boundaries that contain Cowichan in, or worse, the reserve maps, right? Hey, there's no reserve here, it's not our problem. These kinds of things really, I think, do bring in different awareness to the kinds of indigenous lands that we live in, and we're happy to be partners in that. This is a project, one of the classes, a French immersion class went out there and they did their own big map. It's a kind of a big class. It's a huge thing, like bigger than that board, sharing what they learned from that experience. And I think teachers are really appreciating having a new local resource. We're also playing a little bit with some virtual reality technology. If you've ever tried those headsets like Google Cardboard, you can explore some of the excavations that we did at Yumnuts and see pictures of some of the finds and some of the layers of the strata, because right now there's no dig going on at this site. You just look at it and it doesn't look like an active archaeological site. So we're doing those kinds of things. Speaking of education, I want to shout out here to Chris Arnett, who I'm happy to see. And Chris was the editor of this most remarkable book, Two Houses Half Buried in Sand. So if any of you with notepads want to write that book title down, this is a must-buy book. I have all my Anth 433 students read this book as required reading. This is a book that Chris edited the work that Beryl Cryer had done with Siemtenot and many of her family members back in the 1930s, sharing stories between Beryl Cryer, who was a newspaper reporter, and this woman and her friends and family who lived near Penelkut Island and Sussy and Westholme area at the time, near Chemainus. And when we started reading these stories as students after Chris put out the volume, we really started thinking about, this is all about the land. These are the stories of the place that these women were experiencing this moment in their lives. And so we thought there would be an awesome opportunity for us to create a really comprehensive web map that tries to look at every single place that the women and men who shared their stories with Beryl Cryer in that book spoke about, and to connect those places that we mapped out with the page number references in the book. And in fact, we will also put links to some of the online, the ebook version of it that's available in some of the public libraries on the island. And so when you look at these maps, they're very easy to use. You can do it on your computer, you can do it on your cell phone, you can click on any particular place and get information about it. Or you can look through, if you're interested in fishing places or places about mythology and so on, you can look at it that way. And what we didn't know when we came up with this is that teachers would also love this kind of project. So the kids in the schools in Ladysmith and Chemainus now, their teachers are walking them through the book that Chris edited and this map as a way to engage students in knowing about the place that they're living in now. Not just the Indigenous students, but all the kids in the community can come to have a much better understanding of where they're living. I think it's very powerful. So you can see part of the moral of my story here, and I see I've been talking for an hour, so I'll try to wrap up soon, but part of the moral of the story I'm trying to tell you is that I find those legal and political maps pretty frustrating. We spend a lot of time and energy and money into doing a really good job of those, to be thinking about evidentiary standards and hearsay and all of that kind of practice. And they very much get siloed. They become the maps that are only really seen by the negotiators and the legal counsels and their advisors. And the places where these things are really impactful and meaningful are with the kids in the schools, right? They're in community members generally circulating around, so that we don't have the kinds of poor information that a lot of opinion today is really circulating with. And I think that these are compelling reasons to try to break down the silos and draw on good ethnography through a kind of cartographic form to engage children and the public, as well as have a hand in that legal and political debate. So I'll just show a few other projects and maybe speak to them a little more briefly. Lyaxon First Nation on Valdez Island have a very interesting story. A large part of Valdez Island. So this, if you were standing on the banks here, just overlooking Wreck Beach, and you were looking across over to Vancouver Island, Valdez Island is one of the first islands you see before you get to sort of Nanaimo, Ladysmith area. It's right there, and a lot of that island is reserve land. There used to be 3 occupied villages on there, but in the 20th century, everybody moved away, so nobody's living there full time anymore. And so Lyaxon approached us to do oral histories with their community members about, well, what happened in the 20th century? Why did everybody leave? And what was the sort of spatial arrangement of that? And we heard some incredible stories from elders about their experiences in residential schools, their experiences and difficulties in the post-war boom economy, and also their deep attachments to these places, and how even though they're not living there anymore, the people are removed from that place is so important. And we heard a lot about those kinds of values. So we had that project, yes. So maybe I'll take us just across the strait there from Valdez Island over to Vancouver Island to the area around Ladysmith and the Staminas First Nation. And the poster that circulated for this event had a picture of me and Ray Harris from Staminas First Nation laughing it up on one of the docks, talking about all of these places. In fact, this particular map I'm showing you here was a boat ride that Ray and I did just around Coffin Point and out to Colette Bay, with Ray just pointing out all these incredible places that were important to him in his life. And we had a project that ran in kind of an after-school club with my graduate student Amy Becker here and members of the Staminas community whose kids were in the public school. And after school, Amy would get together with the kids, and the kids would invite their uncles and their aunts and their grandparents, their parents, out for a car ride. And they'd go to one of the places, about 20 places that we had, in a previous project, collected some Hulkameetum names about. They'd go for a drive to that place, and they'd say, Uncle, why is this place important? What can you tell me about this place? And the kids had a video camera, and they would record the stories that were shared from their families, and then they made a map. They made a map with embedded YouTube videos of all of these incredible things, deeply moving things at times. When this moment of sharing between, the young high school kid and maybe a fellow like Willie Seymour here, the late Willie Seymour, who's, nobody had really asked him about that particular place before, and so he really wanted to share about that. And these are really beautiful places, really beautiful interaction. The kids' map, like the other ones, are kind of organized in a very user-friendly Google Maps format that any kid or teacher can access in the school. Staminas community formulated a committee to vet all of the information that we had, because some of the sharing got into some pretty sensitive issues. So we didn't want to have everything, out there on the internet. And I would say that again, this map ended up being a little too powerful. Maybe I'll just put it this way. So we didn't do a land use and occupancy study. This was just 20 places near home and kids talking to their elders about it. And those, about the 70 or so stories that were collected, about 53 of them were approved for circulation in this kind of context, mainly to be used in the schools and for local public education. But there got to be concerns that there might be, problems with all the white spaces on the map, or problems maybe that we can't anticipate with what somebody said that might be, a problem for a litigator at some point down the road. And so today, unfortunately, the Stamina Stories Places project is not circulating broadly in the community. We've turned that map off in terms of the visibility of it, in recognition that even the stories that are generally intended for conversations between young people and elders when we map them, when we fix them down on that cartographic space, have just that so much power. It really is remarkable. So the last little slide I have here is Utustanaut. This is my friend Mandy Jones. Mandy's a teacher in the high school of Ladysmith. And did you all know that last year was the Year of Indigenous Languages? And maybe some of you on the Day of Indigenous Languages in August opened up the Google search bar and it said, just below the search bar, today is the International Day of Indigenous Languages. For more information, click here. Anybody see that? Well, I did. I was really excited about it because Google highlighted and translated into 10 languages worldwide and made it that link available everywhere on the planet that day. For a project called Celebrating Indigenous Languages, where we work to bring together voices of a whole bunch of different Indigenous language speakers and share them through Google Earth. So if we look at Utustanaut's little story here, for instance, you can see
one of the basic greetings that we use here in Hulkameetnam is asking, how are you? Ia-chu-ai-o. Ia-chu-ai-o.
So
in our territory here, we speak Hulkameetnam. Hulkameetnam is spoken from Nanoose Bay all the way to Mill Bay on the eastern side of Vancouver Island. A very dear word, mother. Tain. Neath pat I aitmit tain. This is my beautiful mother.
So when this launched worldwide, it got quite a bit of media coverage, and Mandy got many requests for interviews on the National and APTN and CTV and everything else. And it's just remarkable to hear her sharing about how strongly, positively she felt about being involved in a project like this. It's a pretty straightforward map. It's a dot on a map that puts Hulkameetnam languages on the in relation to other Indigenous languages in the world, and she was so proud of being able to share her language and share her life's work alongside the so many other Indigenous peoples. I'm just playing with it here on my screen, and I think that it speaks to the power of this kind of work. This power of this kind of work, not only to deal with our kind of legal and political issues in as much as they can, not only to grapple with kind of intergenerational knowledge transfer and public education, but also just in terms of pride and healing and all the kind of good things that go when we pay attention and we do ethnography and these kinds of collaborative projects in a good way. So I think I will skip to the end of my PowerPoint and invite you all to check out our website, and thank you all for listening to me.